Stop calling me, I'm in a meeting. My husband hung up on me at exactly 1:43 p.m. 14 minutes later, I watched him kiss another woman in the lobby of the Indianapolis Marriott downtown. If you've ever had a moment when your whole body knows the truth before your mind catches up, you'll understand what happened next. I just stood there, not moving, not breathing, holding a paper cup of coffee I'd bought 5 minutes earlier. The coffee slipped from my hand and splashed onto the marble floor. I barely noticed, because my husband of 31 years was standing 20 feet away with his arm around another woman, and he looked happy, not nervous, not guilty, happy. Looking back now, I think that was the part that hurt most. My name is Susan Parker. I'm 54 years old. I live in Dayton, Ohio. Until that Thursday afternoon, I would have described my life as ordinary in the best possible way. My husband Greg and I had raised 2 children, paid off most of our mortgage, survived layoffs, medical scares, aging parents, and every challenge that comes with a long marriage. We weren't one of those couples who held hands everywhere. We weren't posting anniversary photos online. But we were steady. At least I thought we were. The changes started slowly. So slowly that I almost missed them. Greg began buying clothes without me. That may sound silly, but trust me. A man who spent 30 years wearing the same brands doesn't suddenly start dressing like a pharmaceutical sales representative without a reason. New jackets, expensive shoes, fancy cologne. The kind that arrived in dark glass bottles with names nobody could pronounce. Then came the phone habits. He used to leave his phone anywhere. Kitchen counter, living room chair, bathroom sink. Suddenly it never left his pocket. Ever. One evening I walked into the kitchen while he was texting. The screen disappeared so quickly you'd think he'd been handling classified government secrets. I laughed. "What are you hiding?" His reaction surprised me. "Nothing." Too fast. Too sharp. Then he forced a smile. "Work stuff." That answer became his favorite. Work stuff. Conference calls. Client dinners. Business trips. Everything became work. I tried not to be suspicious. At our age, nobody wants to become the paranoid spouse. I talked myself out of concern repeatedly. Then Indianapolis happened. Greg told me he was attending a 2-day insurance conference. Apparently some regional leadership event. Networking. Presentations. The usual corporate language that makes your eyes glaze over. Thursday afternoon, I was repainting our guest bedroom. Halfway through choosing paint samples at Home Depot, I called him. Nothing important. I simply wanted his opinion. The call connected. "Hey," I said. Silence. Then Greg answered. "What?" I paused. The tone immediately felt wrong. "Sorry, bad time. I'm in a meeting." "Okay, I just wanted to—" "Susan, stop calling me, I'm in a meeting." Click. The line went dead. I stood there staring at my phone. Something wasn't right. It wasn't the words. People get busy. It was how he said them. After 31 years, you learn someone's voice. You learn when they're tired, stressed, annoyed, happy. This sounded like panic. The feeling followed me into the parking lot, followed me into my car, followed me halfway home. Then I did something completely out of character. I turned east instead, toward Indianapolis. The drive took a little over 2 hours. During most of it, I argued with myself. You're being ridiculous. Turn around. Go home. What if he's exactly where he says he is? What if you embarrass yourself? All reasonable questions. None of them stopped me. By 3:15 p.m., I was sitting inside the Marriott lobby pretending to check emails. The place buzzed with business travelers, rolling suitcases, conference badges, people carrying Starbucks cups. Nobody paid attention to me, which was exactly what I wanted. Then the revolving door turned, and everything changed. Greg walked inside. A woman walked beside him. She looked younger than me, maybe 38, 39. Long dark hair, white summer blouse, confident smile. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged wherever she happened to be. They weren't behaving like co-workers. There was no uncertainty, no professional distance. They moved together naturally, comfortably. Then she touched his arm. Greg smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in months, and kissed her. Just like that. 3 decades of marriage reduced to a moment in a hotel lobby. I wish I could tell you I marched over and confronted them. I didn't. I sat there frozen. Eventually, instinct took over. I pulled out my phone. Took photographs. Several of them. Enough that nobody could ever call me crazy. Enough that nobody could ever tell me I imagined it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I checked into a Hampton Inn a few miles away. Barely slept. Spent hours staring at the ceiling. Replaying every conversation from the past year. Every warning sign. Every excuse, every lie. The next morning I returned to the Marriott, not because I enjoyed punishment, because I wanted answers. I arrived shortly before checkout time, found a seat near the lobby cafe, ordered coffee, waited. At 9:52 a.m., Greg and the woman appeared. They approached the front desk together. The receptionist smiled, typed something, then reached beneath the counter. She pulled out a large manila envelope. "Mr. Parker," she said. "This was left for you." Greg frowned, took the envelope, opened it. Everything changed. His face lost color instantly. Not a little. Completely. I've never seen anything like it. One moment he looked relaxed. The next he looked as if someone had informed him the world was ending. The woman beside him noticed too. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. He kept reading, then reading again. His hands trembled slightly. She reached for the papers. He pulled them away. For a moment I forgot all about the affair, because whatever was inside that envelope clearly terrified him. Then Greg looked up, straight across the lobby, straight at me. Our eyes met. The shock on his face deepened. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then he folded the papers, grabbed the envelope, and rushed toward the exit. The woman hurried after him. "Greg!" He ignored her. By the time I reached the doors, he was already running across the parking lot toward his car, not driving back to the conference, not returning upstairs, running home. And as I stood there watching him disappear, I realized something important. The affair wasn't the biggest secret my husband was hiding. Whatever had been inside that envelope scared him far more than getting caught with another woman. And I intended to find out why. I followed Greg all the way back to Ohio, not closely enough to get noticed, just close enough to know where he was going. The drive from Indianapolis to Dayton normally takes a little over 2 hours. That morning it felt much longer, partly because my mind kept replaying the image of him kissing another woman, partly because I couldn't stop thinking about the envelope. Every few minutes I'd see his face again, the way the color drained out of it. The panic, the urgency. A man caught cheating usually comes up with excuses. A man who believes he's about to lose something important drives like his life depends on it. Greg drove like the second man. When we reached Dayton, I expected him to head to his office. Instead, he turned toward our neighborhood. That surprised me. Then he surprised me again. He didn't park normally. He practically threw his SUV into the driveway. By the time I pulled onto the next street, he was already running toward the front door. I parked where he couldn't see me. Then I watched. For the next 40 minutes, Greg moved through the house like a man searching for buried treasure. Or a bomb. Sometimes it was hard to tell which. From the front windows, I could see him opening drawers, closets, cabinets, storage bins. Twice he disappeared into the garage. Once he carried a stack of file boxes into the kitchen. Then another stack. At one point, he actually dumped papers across the dining room table. I knew because I recognized the table. I'd picked it out 20 years earlier. Watching him tear through our life like that felt strangely surreal, like spying on a stranger who happened to be living in my house. Eventually, he loaded several folders into his SUV and drove away. I waited another 15 minutes before going inside. The moment I stepped through the door, I knew I wasn't imagining things. The house looked like a tornado had passed through. Cabinet doors stood open. File drawers hung halfway out. Documents covered the dining room table. Greg hadn't been looking for something. He'd been desperate to find it. I stood there for a long moment. Then I slowly sat down. For the first time since Indianapolis, I allowed myself to cry. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The kind of crying that arrives when you're exhausted. 31 years. Gone. Not the marriage itself. The certainty. The trust. The feeling that you know the person sitting across from you at breakfast. That was gone. And it wasn't coming back. A few days later, I hired a private investigator. His name was Mike Donnelly, former Dayton police detective, 62 years old, built like a retired linebacker, the kind of man who looked trustworthy simply because he'd spent decades dealing with people who weren't. His office sat above a hardware store in Kettering. Nothing fancy. A desk, a coffee maker, several filing cabinets, and a wall covered with old photographs from his police career. Mike listened carefully while I explained everything. The affair, the hotel, the envelope. The panic. When I finished, he leaned back. "Which part bothers you most?" I thought about it. "The envelope." His eyebrows lifted. "Not the mistress." "Oh, she bothers me." He laughed. "Fair answer. But the envelope changed something." "How?" I took a breath. Before that moment, Greg looked comfortable. Mike nodded. After, he looked terrified. Mike scribbled a note. Then he smiled slightly. Good. I stared at him. Good. You noticed. What does that mean? It means you're paying attention to the right thing. That conversation cost me nearly $3,000. At the time, it felt insane. I wasn't wealthy. I was a woman approaching retirement age who suddenly found herself paying a stranger to investigate her husband. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd lost my mind. Maybe I should have walked away. Maybe I should have filed for divorce immediately. Maybe I should have stopped digging. Then Mike called 2 weeks later, and everything became much more interesting. The woman's name is Vanessa Reed. I grabbed a notebook. Age, 39. That sounded about right. What else? Real estate consultant. Married? No. I wrote quickly. What about Greg? Mike paused, then chuckled. That got my attention. What? You'll enjoy this part. I'm not sure enjoy is the word I'd use. Trust me. He cleared his throat. Vanessa thinks she's moving. Moving where? Your lake house? For several seconds, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. My what? The lake house. I blinked. The lake house had belonged to my father. A beautiful property on Indian Lake. 3 bedrooms. Private dock. A place where our family had spent countless summers. What are you talking about? Mike laughed again. The two of them have apparently been discussing their future. I felt sick. What future? The one where they live happily ever after. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I loved Greg. That chapter was ending quickly. Because he'd apparently built an entire fantasy life while still sharing a roof with me. Then Mike delivered the next surprise. According to multiple sources, Greg promised Vanessa ownership of the lake house. I almost dropped my phone. Ownership. That's what she believes. The room suddenly felt smaller. The lake house wasn't just property. It was family history, memories, my father's legacy. And apparently Greg had been handing it out like a free promotional item. Over the next week, Mike uncovered more details. Enough details that the situation became almost absurd. Vanessa had started making plans, big plans. She'd told friends she was relocating, started discussing renovations, even picked out furniture. At one point, she apparently debated whether the dock needed replacing. A dock she didn't own. At a house she didn't own. The entire thing would have been funny if it weren't happening to me. Then came the text message. And honestly, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee. Greg had been communicating with Vanessa constantly. That part wasn't surprising. The surprising part was that he accidentally sent her a screenshot meant for his attorney. Vanessa misunderstood it completely. According to Mike, she spent 2 days convinced Greg was secretly preparing to leave her. Apparently, she'd called him 17 times in one afternoon. 17. At one point, she reportedly showed up at his office demanding answers. The image of my calm, carefully organized husband trying to explain a mistaken screenshot to an angry mistress was unexpectedly satisfying. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. A genuine smile. Small victories matter. Even ridiculous ones. A few days later, Mike asked me to meet him. We sat inside a diner near Beaver Creek. The lunch crowd had mostly cleared out. An elderly couple shared pie in the corner. Country music played softly overhead. Mike slid a folder across the table. I found something. I opened it. Property records. Financial records. Legal documents. The deeper I read, the more confused I became. Finally, I looked up. What am I missing? Mike folded his hands. The property. The lake house. He nodded. What about it? A slow smile appeared. The interesting part is that Greg doesn't actually own it. I stared at him. What? He promised Vanessa something he can't legally give away. My pulse quickened. How do you know? Mike tapped the folder. Because the ownership records tell a very different story. I looked down at the paperwork, then back at him. And suddenly I understood why Greg had raced home after reading that envelope. Whatever was inside it had reminded him of one very important fact. The lake house he had been promising to another woman no longer belonged to him. When Mike told me Greg didn't legally own the lake house, I thought there had to be some mistake. Not because I doubted Mike. Because I remembered signing paperwork years earlier without paying much attention to it. Apparently Greg had done the same. And now that oversight was coming back to haunt him. The following Tuesday, I met with an attorney named Rebecca Lawson. Her office sat in a red brick building near downtown Dayton. Nothing flashy. Just a quiet, professional place where people went to solve problems they wished they didn't have. I carried a folder filled with documents Mike had collected. Property records. Financial statements. Notes. Questions. A lot of questions. Rebecca spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing everything before looking up. Susan, do you remember updating your estate plan after your father passed away? I nodded. 2 years ago. And do you remember creating a trust? Vaguely. That answer felt embarrassing. My father had always been organized. The kind of man who labeled storage bins and balanced his checkbook to the penny. After he died, there had been lawyers, accountants, and paperwork everywhere. At the time I was grieving. I signed documents because professionals told me they were necessary. Rebecca smiled gently. You're not alone. Meaning, most people sign estate documents without remembering every detail. Fair enough? She opened a file. Then she turned several pages toward me. There it is. I looked down. Trust documents. Property schedules. Legal descriptions. Signatures. My signature. Greg's signature. I stared at the page. Then stared again. The answer sat right in front of me. The lake house wasn't owned by Greg. It wasn't even directly owned by me. It belonged to a trust established after my father's death. The trust existed specifically to protect family assets, including the lake property. Rebecca pointed toward a paragraph. See this section? I nodded. The trustee controls major decisions regarding the property. What does that mean? It means your husband cannot sell it. I felt something shift inside me. A small piece of a puzzle finally sliding into place. What about transferring ownership? No. Promising it to someone? Rebecca actually laughed. Absolutely not. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she added something important. Unless the trustee approves it, Greg has no authority whatsoever. I leaned back slowly. Suddenly, Indianapolis made sense. The envelope. The panic. The race home. The frantic search through file cabinets. Whatever Greg had received in that hotel lobby had reminded him of a legal reality he'd completely forgotten. Or ignored. Rebecca handed me another document. Certified records. Official notices. Correspondence. As I read through them, my stomach tightened. Someone connected to the trust had apparently learned what Greg was planning. The envelope contained copies of ownership records and a formal warning. A very clear warning. A warning stating that Greg had no legal authority over the property. No authority to sell it, transfer it, or promise it to anyone, especially not a mistress. For several seconds I simply sat there. Then an unexpected feeling arrived. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. Something more complicated. Because suddenly I understood what would happen next. Vanessa was going to discover she'd built her future around a promise that never existed. And despite everything, part of me felt sorry for her. Not much, but a little. After all, she'd participated in the affair. Still, she'd apparently believed Greg. Maybe because she wanted to. Maybe because he wanted her to. Either way, reality was heading toward her fast. Rebecca interrupted my thoughts. There's more. That sentence had become my least favorite phrase. What now? Your investigator mentioned Vanessa recently quit her job. I nodded. Apparently. Rebecca folded her hands. That's significant. The more we talked, the worse it became. Vanessa hadn't simply made plans. She'd acted on them. She'd informed colleagues she was relocating. Started selling furniture. Placed her condo on the market. Told friends she was beginning a new chapter. All because Greg convinced her the lake house would be theirs. The level of recklessness was astonishing. And strangely revealing. Because it told me something important about Greg. He wasn't merely lying to me anymore. He was lying to everyone. Even the woman he claimed to love. That realization stayed with me for days. A week later, another problem arrived. This one hurt more than I expected. My son Brian called. At first, the conversation felt normal. Work. Weather. Football. Then his voice changed. Dad says things are getting ugly. I closed my eyes. Here we go. What exactly did he tell you? A pause. Then, he says you're making things harder than they need to be. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because I honestly didn't know what else to do. Brian sounded uncomfortable. Mom, I don't know what to think anymore. That sentence broke my heart. Not because he doubted me. Because I could hear how much he hated being caught in the middle. A day later, Emily called. The conversation wasn't much different. Apparently, Greg had been working hard. Carefully telling his version of events. Painting himself as reasonable. Painting me as bitter. The strategy was familiar. If people question your behavior, redirect attention. Create confusion. Blur the facts. Unfortunately for him, facts have a way of surviving. Even when people don't want them to. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There were nights I sat alone at the kitchen table wondering whether this entire fight was worth it. Part of me wanted to walk away. Forget the investigation. Forget the documents. Forget the betrayal. Just start over somewhere else. Then I'd remember my father, the lake house, the years I'd spent helping preserve what mattered to our family. And I'd keep going. Not out of revenge, out of responsibility. A few days later, Mike called. His voice sounded unusually excited. "You sitting down." "I am now. You'll want to hear this." I grabbed a notebook. "What happened?" "Greg scheduled an event." I frowned. "What kind of event?" "A gathering." "Where?" "Indian Lake." My heart skipped. "The lake house." "Yep." I stood up immediately. "Why?" Mike laughed. "That's the interesting part." "Tell me." "According to several people, he's planning a major announcement." I stared through the kitchen window at the backyard. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder, completely unaware that my life had become absurd. "What kind of announcement?" Mike lowered his voice. "I think he's planning to introduce Vanessa publicly." I nearly dropped the phone. "What? Family, friends, church members, neighbors?" I sat back down, slowly, very slowly, because suddenly everything became clear. Greg wasn't backing down. He wasn't admitting mistakes. He wasn't correcting lies. He was doubling down, building an entire public celebration around a fantasy he couldn't legally deliver. And for the first time since Indianapolis, I realized exactly how this story might end. Not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, but in front of everyone, at the very lake house he never should have promised away. The invitation arrived 3 days later, not by mail, not formally, through Facebook. My cousin Diane called me on a Wednesday evening. "Susan, did you see Greg's post?" I was sitting at the kitchen table paying bills. "No." There was a pause. "Oh." The way she said it immediately told me I wasn't going to like whatever came next. "What did he post?" Another pause. Then, something about celebrating new beginnings. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. Diane continued carefully. "There's a gathering at the lake house next Saturday." I already knew. Mike had warned me. Still hearing it confirmed made my stomach tighten. "How many people?" "Looks like everybody." I laughed. A short, humorless laugh. Everybody. That was exactly Greg's style. If he was going to tell a story, he wanted an audience. After hanging up, I opened Facebook. There it was. A smiling photograph of the lake house at sunset. The dock. The water. The porch my father built with his own hands. Below it, "Join us for a celebration of exciting new chapters ahead." No details. No explanation. Just enough mystery to attract attention. Dozens of comments filled the page. People congratulating him. People asking questions. People assuming wonderful things were happening. I stared at the screen, then closed my laptop. For the first time in weeks, anger wasn't the dominant emotion. Embarrassment was, because Greg wasn't simply lying anymore. He was building an entire public performance, and part of me feared becoming an unwilling character in it. The next morning I met with Rebecca. She reviewed several new documents while I drank terrible office coffee. Finally, she looked up. "You're going." It wasn't a question. I sighed. "Do I have to?" "No." "Then maybe I'll stay home." Rebecca smiled. "You won't." I hated that she was right. "Why not?" "Because if you stay home, Greg controls the story." That answer sat heavily between us. She wasn't talking about revenge. She wasn't talking about humiliation. She was talking about facts. The truth only works when people hear it. Unfortunately, hearing it sometimes requires showing up. A few days later, I drove to Indian Lake. Not for the gathering, just to think. The property looked exactly as I remembered. The dock stretched into calm water. The old oak tree still stood near the shoreline. The screened porch overlooked the lake. Generations of memories lived there. Summer cookouts, fishing trips, birthday parties, family reunions. My father teaching the grandchildren how to bait hooks. Standing there alone, I suddenly felt sad. Not because of Greg, because betrayal steals things you never expected to lose. Not only trust, comfort, traditions, places that once felt safe. I sat on the dock for nearly an hour, watching boats cross the water, listening to waves tap against wooden posts, trying to decide what kind of person I wanted to be when this was over. Because revenge has a strange way of changing people. You start out wanting justice, then anger takes over, then pride. If you're not careful, you become someone you don't recognize. I didn't want that. I wanted the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. The following Monday, Mike called. "You free for lunch?" That usually meant news. We met at a diner near Springfield. The kind of place where waitresses call everybody honey. Mike ordered meatloaf. I ordered soup. Neither of us paid much attention to the food. He opened a folder. I've been talking to people. About Greg. And Vanessa. That got my attention. What now? Mike shook his head. She's fully committed. I already suspected that. But hearing it confirmed still felt strange. Meaning, she believes this weekend changes everything. I stared at him. She still thinks she's getting the lake house. Apparently. I rubbed my forehead. The situation had crossed the line from dishonest into ridiculous. Mike slid several notes across the table. Witness statements. Conversations. Details. One thing became clear. Vanessa wasn't pretending. She genuinely believed Greg had secured their future, which meant she was about to experience the same thing I had. The moment reality collides with a lie. Mike leaned back. There's one more thing. Of course there was. What? The trustee agreed to attend. For a second, I forgot to breathe. The trustee? Yes. I immediately understood why that mattered. The trustee controlled the property. Not Greg. Not me. The trust. And the trustee happened to possess every document necessary to prove it. I looked at Mike. Will he say something? Mike smiled. If necessary. That answer was enough. Saturday arrived faster than I expected. The drive to Indian Lake felt strangely peaceful. Blue sky. Warm weather. Traffic light. A perfect Ohio summer afternoon. The lake house came into view around 1:30. Cars already lined both sides of the road. Neighbors. Church friends. Former co-workers. Family members. At least 50 people. Maybe more. The moment I parked, I considered leaving. Seriously considered it. Nobody would have blamed me. I could have driven away. Gone home. Avoided the entire spectacle. Instead, I stepped out of the car. Straightened my blouse. And walked toward the house. Several people greeted me warmly. Others looked uncomfortable. Most clearly had no idea what was happening. Inside food-covered folding tables, children played in the yard. Music drifted through outdoor speakers. The atmosphere felt festive. Almost cheerful. Then I saw Greg, standing near the porch, wearing a navy blazer, smiling, shaking hands, acting like a man completely in control. Beside him stood Vanessa, a bright summer dress, perfect hair, confident posture. If she felt nervous, she hid it well. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us spoke. Then she looked away. By 3 o'clock, the crowd had grown even larger. People gathered near the shoreline. Others sat in lawn chairs. Conversations blended into one constant hum. I noticed the trustee arrive shortly afterward. A quiet man in his 60s named Harold Brennan. Gray suit. Leather briefcase. Professional expression. Nobody paid much attention to him, which was exactly why his presence mattered. The documents rested inside that briefcase. The truth rested there too. At approximately 3:30, Greg stepped onto the porch. Someone handed him a microphone. The crowd gradually quieted. Vanessa moved beside him, smiling proudly. Greg raised his hand. Thank you all for coming. Applause followed. He waited, smiling, confident, certain. Then he spoke the words I'd been expecting for weeks. Today marks a new chapter. And for the first time all afternoon, I smiled, because I knew something he didn't. This wasn't going to be his announcement. It was going to be his reckoning. Today marks a new chapter. Greg stood on the porch holding a microphone. The lake sparkled behind him. The afternoon sun reflected off the water. People smiled. Some applauded. Others raised plastic cups. To anyone arriving late, it probably looked like a retirement party or an engagement celebration. A happy occasion. A hopeful one. Only a handful of us knew better. Vanessa stood beside Greg looking absolutely certain of herself. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She'd built an entire future around promises she never bothered to verify. Then again, so had I once. The difference was that my promises had lasted 31 years. Greg cleared his throat. First, I want to thank everyone for being here. More applause? He loved an audience. Always had. Birthday parties. Church events. Neighborhood gatherings. Greg enjoyed being the man holding the microphone. The man telling the story. The man everyone listened to. Unfortunately for him this time, he wasn't the only person with something to say. He smiled at Vanessa. She smiled back. A few people exchanged knowing looks. The message wasn't subtle. Then Greg continued, "Life doesn't always go the way you expect." I nearly laughed. That was certainly true. Sometimes you get a second chance. Vanessa's smile widened. My daughter Emily, standing beside me, quietly muttered, "Oh, this is going to be bad." I squeezed her hand. Just wait. Greg took a breath. As many of you know, the last year has brought major changes. Several heads nodded. Others looked confused. Then he finally said it. Vanessa and I are building a future together. The crowd reacted exactly as you'd expect. Gasps, whispers, raised eyebrows. Some people looked shocked. Others looked relieved that the mystery had finally been explained. A few church friends suddenly became very interested in their shoes. Nobody wants front row seats to a public scandal. Yet there they were. Greg smiled confidently. As part of that future, we've made plans for this property. There it was. The moment he'd been building toward. The reason for the gathering. The reason for the lies. The reason for the envelope. Vanessa looked proud, almost triumphant. Then Greg said the words that changed everything. This lake house will become our home. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Confused silence. People processing information. Trying to understand exactly what they were hearing. Then a calm voice spoke from the crowd. Actually, Greg, that's not correct. Every head turned. Harold Brennan stood near the back. Gray suit. Leather briefcase. Quiet man. Steady voice. Greg froze. The smile vanished immediately. Harold stepped forward. Nobody stopped him. Nobody even spoke. The crowd simply moved aside. Instinctively. The way people do when they sense something important is happening. Greg looked nervous for the first time all afternoon. Harold, he said. The trustee nodded politely. Good afternoon. Vanessa glanced between them. Confusion slowly replacing confidence. Harold set his briefcase on a folding table. Opened it. Removed several folders. The exact same kind of folders Greg had desperately searched for months earlier. The exact kind of documents that had been referenced inside that hotel envelope. My pulse quickened. Not from excitement. From relief. Because the truth was finally about to do its job. Harold addressed the crowd calmly. I apologize for interrupting. His voice carried easily. Professional. Measured. But there appears to be a misunderstanding regarding this property. Greg stepped forward. We can discuss this later. Harold looked at him. No, we really can't. The crowd became very quiet. You could hear waves touching the dock. A child laughing somewhere down the shoreline. Then Harold held up a document. This property is owned by the Parker Family Trust. Murmurs spread immediately. Greg's face tightened. Vanessa looked puzzled. Harold continued. Under the trust agreement, ownership cannot be transferred by Mr. Parker. He paused. Because Mr. Parker does not own the property. The silence afterward felt enormous. Vanessa blinked. What? Nobody answered immediately. Harold simply handed her copies of the paperwork. She stared down at them, then looked at Greg, then back at the papers. The color slowly drained from her face. I recognized that look. I'd seen something very similar in the hotel lobby months earlier. The moment of fantasy collides with reality. Greg tried recovering. There must be some confusion. Harold shook his head. There isn't. Another document appeared. Then another. Certified records. Trust agreements. Legal filings. Every page signed. Every page valid. Every page devastating. Vanessa flipped through them desperately. Faster and faster. Then she stopped. One signature had caught her attention. Greg's? His own signature sat directly beneath the trust agreement. Proof that he'd known. Or at the very least proof that he'd signed the paperwork. The crowd noticed. People always notice. Especially when someone runs out of explanations. One of Greg's former co-workers spoke first. So you knew, another voice joined in. You promised her this place anyway. Questions began arriving from every direction. Not angry. Not hostile. Just honest. The kind of questions people ask when they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. Greg had no answers. Or at least no good ones. Vanessa finally found her voice. You told me it was yours. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. She took a step closer. You told me we were moving here. Greg opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Because what could he say? The documents were right there. The truth was right there. Every promise had collapsed under its own weight. For a moment I thought Vanessa might cry. Instead she laughed. A short stunned laugh. The kind people make when reality becomes too absurd to process normally. Then she handed the papers back to Harold, looked directly at Greg, and walked away. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No shouting. No scene. She simply got into her car and left. Several guests quietly stepped aside to let her pass. Nobody tried stopping her. The aftermath felt strangely calm. The crowd slowly broke into conversations. People compared notes, asked questions, connected dots. For the first time in months, I didn't need to explain anything. The facts spoke for themselves. A little later, Brian approached me. My son looked embarrassed. "Mom," I smiled gently. "Hi." He looked down, then back up. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words meant more than he probably realized. Not because I needed an apology, because he finally understood. Emily hugged me shortly afterward. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. As the afternoon wound down, Greg eventually approached me. The confident man from the microphone was gone. Only the tired version remained. For several moments we stood silently overlooking the lake. Then he spoke. "I never thought it would end like this." I watched sunlight dance across the water. Neither did I. That was the truth. For both of us. He looked older, smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. A man facing the consequences of choices he'd spent months avoiding. I messed everything up. I nodded. Yes. There wasn't much else to say. Some mistakes become too large for explanations. Eventually, he walked away, and I let him. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Not quickly, not easily. Real life rarely works that way. There were attorneys, negotiations, difficult conversations. But there was also progress, the kind that arrives one ordinary day at a time. Today, when I sit on the porch at the lake house, I don't think much about Greg. I think about my father, my grandchildren, summer evenings, fishing poles leaning against the dock, the things that actually matter. If this story taught me anything, it's that the truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives in paperwork people never bothered to read. And if you've ever doubted your instincts because someone told you not to trust them, I hope you'll remember this. Pay attention. Ask questions. Protect your peace. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of something you've lived through, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Sometimes sharing our experiences helps someone else find the courage to face their own. The end.